Hi everyone. So this is Zunker Chapter 6, Using Standardized Tests and Self-Assessment Procedures in Career Counseling. What this chapter is going to basically cover are the different components when it comes to an assessment, and then also the different types of assessments that are available for you to use potentially in your agency of work. Okay, let's move along. Standardized tests and assessment inventories have been closely associated with career counseling movement, and that's actually quite true because this is how people determine in a large group of people who has skills for specific things in an easy way. Okay, in 1883, U.S. Civil Service Commission used it for job placement. In the 1940s, multiple aptitude test batteries used in educational and vocational counseling. 1947, Scholastic Aptitude Test, also known as the SATs, admission criteria for educational institutions. And then in 1959, the American College Testing Program, also known as ACT, which is another type of test that you probably had taken before you took the SATs. The last 30 years, more emphasis on skills identification through informal techniques. Informal techniques means other methods that are not necessarily a test or a questionnaire, but it might be through observation and stuff like that. Okay. Major issue, how assessment results can be used most effectively in career counseling is always going to be a concern. Okay, a good approach, assessment results as one only facet of individuality to be evaluated in career decision process. So that's a good approach, is assessment results as only one facet of individuality to be evaluated in career decision process. A facet is kind of like one side. And the thing is, as we've been talking about, is that people are multifaceted, which means that we have different, kind of like parts, kind of like a diamond. A diamond is multifaceted. That's why it shines or it refracts light really well. So if we give out a bunch of different assessments, then we'll understand more facets of a person. The diversity of the person. So we're talking about skills, aptitudes, interests, values, achievements, personality characteristics, dysfunctional thinking, maturity, contextual interaction, and salient cultural variables. Salient basically means important or things that exist for a purpose in cultural variables. Okay. We are in an increasingly diverse group in America, and that's true by the diverse culture that we have here. In 2005, the American Counseling Association created the Code of Ethics. The responsibilities of test users and test developers is mentioned in the Code of Ethics. So you don't want to just give anyone any type of test just because you want to. As a test developer or a person who's actually going to give the test, because that would be unethical. Because why did you do that? Just because you wanted to know certain things about the person? Well, that's not the point of assessments. That is actually, you need to have a purpose before you give out the assessment. Point out the necessity for counselors to select and use assessment instruments that are appropriate for each client. Psychometric concepts for selecting assessment instruments. Assessments has the important role of information gathering, accurate client self-assessment, problem identification, interventions, and outcome evaluations. So those are all the different components when you guys are basically going to give out assessments. So one of the most important things that we talk about when it comes to developing an assessment is to know what the reliability is. And you probably have heard of reliability. This is going to explain to you different ways of telling how reliable a test is. Okay, and we'll also define what reliable means as well. So the coefficient correlation of reliability is the degree to which a test score is dependable and consistent. So what does that mean? That means that when you do repeated trials, it will yield approximately the same results. Okay, so let's say that you take a specific test and you score 10, right? The next time you take that test again, you should score around 10. So it could be 8, 9, or maybe 11 or 12, and that's similar, right? However, it's not reliable if you score 10 the first time and then you take the same test again maybe 3 weeks later and you score 2. And then 2 or 3 weeks later you score a 15. There are such drastic differences, it's not a reliable assessment. Does that make sense? However, if you take the test once and you score a 10, and then you take it again 2 or 3 weeks later and you get a 9, and then 2 or 3 weeks later you get an 8, and then 2 or 3 weeks later you get a 10, those are all pretty similar in that sense, so that means it would be reliable. Okay? When tests are used for high-stake decisions, each test should be scrutinized carefully according to its purpose, content, appropriate use, and validity and reliability. And we'll define validity next after we define reliability. So reliability and validity are critically important. The test developer is responsible for providing evidence that reliability is sufficient and for its intended use. So when you look at an assessment and when you get an assessment, usually there is a manual that comes along with those assessments. And within that manual, they would show you that they've actually tested this assessment with a lot of people. They've normed it. Remember the bell curve that we were talking about before? All that information, when they created it, should be in there so that you know how reliable this assessment is, okay? So you want something that has a good reliability score because you know that that means that this thing is very, very dependable. And the ones that we use usually are quite reliable and also valid, and we'll define validity in a little bit. It's the newer ones or ones that are not as popular. They might not necessarily have the reliability. So you always want to look at the manual before you give it the assessment to someone to make sure that it is reliable. Okay. Reliability coefficients are obtained by so this is how you test to see if a thing is reliable, okay? It's called a test retest, and that is when the same test is given twice with certain time intervals. Like I said before, you give the test once, let's say January 1st, and then you give the test again February 1st, and then you'll give the test again, let's say maybe March 1st, okay? So there's a little bit of time so that people might kind of forget the questions, you know, so that when they do the score, the test again, they're going to kind of, you know, it's kind of within the similar, memory, you know, it's not completely memorized because if you, let's say, give the test on January 1st and then give the test again January 2nd, they've already remembered a bunch of stuff and they probably thought about it and stuff. So you want to give it some time so that people kind of like forget it and stuff like that. That's the theory behind it anyways. So when you do it a bunch of times and the score is similar, then it would be reliable. Alternate form is when equivalent tests are administered within certain time intervals. Okay, so this one basically means that there's two versions of the test or something that is equivalent to it, okay? So let's say that we have test A, right? And then test B. They're very similar. They're supposed to, let's say, measure the same thing. And what you can also do is compare it with an already established assessment. So your assessment that might be new, they'll test it, right? They'll give it to a group of people to take. And then later on, they'll give the test B, which might be a more established one, that's supposed to measure the same thing. And then they're going to compare and contrast to see if they're actually similar, okay? And then we'll see whether or not the scores are similar. And if it is, it would be considered then reliable as well. And then there's also the internal consistency, is when results of one test are divided into parts referred to as a split half. So what that means is, let's say that your assessment has 50 questions. You're going to split all the odd ones on one test, and you're going to split all the even ones on another test, right? So even though it's one test, you're breaking it into two, which is what a split half means. What that means then is that test 1 and test 2 should be very similar in scores. So when you give those two, they should then again be similar scores because they're measuring the same thing. I hope that makes sense. Stability of a test is determined by coefficients of correlation that remain high over long intervals. What that means is, let's say we take it 1 year and then we get the scores and then we test it again year 2 and it's still very similar and dependable, and then year 3 it's still similar again. That would mean that they have stability over a long period of time. And sometimes some assessments will not. And that is when those things will get retired. No one will use them. But then there'll be other assessments that might be more reliable then. And then you would use that. And that's how you see sometimes assessments go in and out of trend. And that's partly because maybe the culture has changed drastically. And so then the scores are not going to be the same or dependable. Okay, I hope that that kind of explains it to you. The reason why I have an RC Cola bottle on the slide is because R stands for reliable, C stands for consistency, which are basically the same thing. It's measuring whether or not the scores are consistently the same. RC Cola. I don't know if you guys drink RC Cola. We love those generic brands, don't we? So anyways, that is a little hint for you, maybe to help you remember what reliability is. It is consistency. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about validity. Validity, the meaningfulness and usefulness of certain inferences based on a test score derived from a test. So what that means is counselors need to answer whether a test measures what it purports to measure. So let's say that we do a test, right? And all the questions have a specific theme maybe. Maybe it's depression. So we want to make sure that when you're making up a test, when you first create a test, that those questions actually ask questions about depression. I know it sounds a little silly, that why wouldn't it, right? But actually sometimes when you take a test, the questions that you're asking actually ask for something else. So let's say that this is called the Beck Depression Inventory. We're going to assume that that means that it should validly measure depression and not measure something else. Maybe loneliness or something like that is actually what it's measuring. If it is, then it's not valid. But if it is measuring depression and it is a depression inventory or assessment or test, then that means it is valid. Okay, so there's different ways to also see whether or not the content is actually valid. So first one is called content validity. Involves opinions of experts about whether the items on a test or inventory represent the content domain of characteristics being measured. So what that means is, let's say that you create an assessment, you're going to give it to people who are specialists in depression. And they will read through and say, these specific questions are good, these specific questions are not good. Take those out because those are not actually measuring depression, they're measuring something else. Okay, so that's one way to test to see whether or not it is by asking experts in the field of depression or whatever it is to go over the questions to see whether or not they really are. The next one is called the criterion validity, and that is the degree to which test scores predict success for outcome criteria. So criterion-based interest inventories related a person's score with a normative group, such as geologists and ministers who are satisfied and stable in their occupation. So let's say that you are creating a test about success in jobs, right? And specifically, you want to ask the people who are happy at their jobs and successful at their jobs what their test results are. Okay, and then do you want to see whether or not those type of questions are also similar to the questions in a criterion base? So the assessment, if let's say in the example here is that geologists and ministers are really happy, then their score should result in happy as well, right? So when they take that test, this inventory that you created, they should say they're happy. However, if they're happy people and they're successful people and they take a test and it says that they're depressed, that means that it's not actually measuring what it's supposed to measure. So again, that means that it is not valid. However, if happy ministers and happy geologists score happy scores, let's say, that they're happy, then that means that it is criterion valid. Okay. The rationale is that people who have similar scores will experience satisfaction in those occupations. Construct validity is the next one. It's developed from theory and research. So example is the construct of intelligence may include one's ability to build colored block designs within time intervals. So that means that Theoretically, people who have very similar scores should be able to complete things in a similar time, let's say, right? So for intelligence, usually it's timed and it's a bunch of, let's say, blocks of color. And you're supposed to do it in a specific order and predict what the next order would be, right? And they're saying that in intelligence tests like that people tend to score within the same amount of time as well, or predict the answers at around the same time. So that might be another way to test for validity. Counselors should be able to explain the purpose of a test, what the test is designed to measure, why a certain test should be useful, how and why a test is considered a valid and reliable instrument, and how the results can be used to assist a client. So what does that mean? That means that you need to know about the assessment before you give it out. You need to read the manual, you need to do research, maybe read articles that people have written that test out these specific assessments to see whether or not they are accurate. And then when your client goes, what is the purpose of this test? You should be able to answer that question. Okay. Counselors must also be sure that the test is appropriate for the client and the results fully account for the client's background and diversity. Remember, we're in a very multicultural world now. So we need to pay attention to see whether or not these tests were normed for people of color as well. Just because that's considerate and they'll be a little bit more accurate, or actually quite accurate then. Okay. Okay, issues in achieving equity in assessments. Each test must be chosen carefully for each client. And I know that sounds silly. However, it is really important that you select the right one for the specific client. But I will tell you this, assessments can cost a lot of money. And depending on the agency that you work at, they might buy specific depression inventories because they like it and maybe it's affordable and stuff like that. But you might not necessarily think it's the greatest one. So you can bring it up to your supervisor and say, you know, I want to advocate for my client to take the specific one instead of that one because of reasons A, B, C, and D, okay, or something like that. But there are some agencies that will say, nope, we're going to use this specific one, and then that's it. And that's partially because it is financially expensive to buy specific tests. Okay, so you want to do your research and see if there's ones that are affordable or ones that are free, ones that don't require training. But sometimes it's necessary that you do one that is, and you need to justify the reasons why. All right, evaluating adaptations and translations of assessment instruments. Technical information manual. So usually, again, like I said before, every assessment will have a manual. Okay, read the test manual to determine if the client is a member of a group that has been included in the normative sample used for validity and reliability analysis. 2, obtain relevant background information about the client. If the English is their dominant language, that you should think about that. Socioeconomic status, their ethnicity, their gender, and then there's other variables as well that you might want to consider, such as like education. Determine if the usefulness of the score report. Counselors determine if a significant proportion of members from the client's ethnic group were represented in the normal sample. Again, when this was created, when they tested it out to see whether or not it was reliable and valid, did they also include people of color, let's say, or a specific ethnicity group that you are working with in that sample? If not, it might not necessarily be as accurate. Evaluating acculturation contextual issues. Adoption of beliefs, values, and practice of the host culture. So in the book, there's a table, 6.1, and it's called On Contextual Assessment Areas. And again, it's on page 166. And basically, it wants you to consider all the other components when it comes to a person of color. So I'll read a couple of them. There's about 20 of them on there that I want you guys to review. The first one is ethnocultural heritage. 2 is racial and ethnocultural identities. 3 is gender and sexual orientation. 4 is socioeconomic status. 5 is physical appearance, ability, or disability. So again, these are things that they want you to consider if you have a specific type of client. And there's 20 of them, and I want you to review all those 20 in the book. Okay, assessment goals and career counseling. Assessment can be part of the intake interview or following it. during counseling. So you will have the intake, which we covered in the previous chapter, and now we're talking about assessment. So you can do it at the same time, or usually people will do it after the intake. And there are certain things that you have, there are certain goals that you'll have, and that's going to be basically covering the rest of this chapter. So the goal 1 is identifying career beliefs. So the purpose is to reveal some of the client's beliefs about careers or about work. Dysfunctional thinking, if you can find it in that person. Decision-making styles, identity issues, maladaptive behaviors, degree of anxiety, fear of failure, and reasons why people are undecided. So when you guys start talking to the client, you're going to be able to identify these things. And there's certain types of assessments that can also help you determine these things. One is the career beliefs inventory. The second is the career thoughts inventory, and one called My Vocational Situation. And of course, you can go and do more research in those if you wish to. I'm just giving you the list, and then you can read into it as well in the book. Goal 2, identifying skills, proficiencies, and abilities. So there are aptitude tests that you can take, measure specific skills and proficiencies, or the ability to acquire certain proficiencies. So basically, what kind of skills can they get? Provide an index of measured skills that are intended to predict how well an individual may perform on a job or in an educational or training program. So that is to see whether or not they're going to be able to be successful in a trade school with a specific topic or major in a specific thing. It's trying to predict it. Is it always 100%? No, because we humans change depending on events that happen in our lives or whatever. It could actually alter it, okay? And then scores of the person's cognitive strengths and weaknesses. Aptitude tests may be purchased as batteries, measuring a number of aptitudes and skills, or as a single test measuring specific aptitudes. So what that means is that you can actually buy a set, or it's also known as a battery. Okay, a battery just means a group of assessments. So purchases the batteries of assessments that measure different types at one time. In 1970, the General Aptitude Test Battery, the GATB, was created. It was developed by the U.S. Employment Service for state employment counselors for 9 aptitudes. So this would measure 9 things, right? Intelligence, verbal, numerical, spatial, form perception, clerical perception, motor coordination, finger dexterity, and manual dexterity. Okay, and the different other types that measure aptitude would be considered the Differential Aptitude Test, or the DAT, the General Aptitude Test Battery, the GATB, the Flanagan Aptitude Classification Test, FACT, and then the Armed Service Vocational Aptitude Battery, the ASVAB, or ASVAB. And that's actually quite famous and well known and probably is the most taken test of all of them. And again, this is like basically measuring a bunch of things so that we can then understand this person. Goal 3 is identifying academic achievement. Academic tests are designed to assess present levels of developed abilities. Current functioning and basic academic skills are arithmetic, math, reading, and then language usage. General survey batteries measures knowledge of most subjects taught in school and is standardized on the same population. What that basically means is that, let's say that the test is given to 12th graders. So it'll be given to only 12th graders because they're all similar. Okay, they won't give the same test, let's say to an 8th grader and then compare it to a 12th grader, then compare it to a 10th grader, because that doesn't really make sense. So it needs to be compared to the same group of people over and over and over again. Single subject test measures knowledge of only one subject content area. So it might be just arithmetic, it might be just reading, it might be just language usage, or it could be a combination of all those. And that would be more of a general survey of battery, right? Remember, battery means a group. Diagnostic batteries measure knowledge of specific proficiencies such as reading, spelling, and arithmetic achievement. And their publishers of achievement tests are the CETB Macmillan McGraw-Hill Educational Test Service, the Houghton Mifflin Company, Harcourt Assessment, and Riverside Publishing Company. Those are people who publish achievement tests. So if you're interested in looking at those, you can then go and do more research on those places. Goal 4 is identifying and confirming interest levels. There's a large body of studies that talk about gender bias and unfairness in career interest measurement. Again, as we get more recent, like within the last 50 years or so, we start to realize that we need to pay attention to multiculturalism. So that's what it's talking about, and also sexism. When we talked about sex typing, certain jobs are meant for men or women because we believe it for some reason. Maybe our parents told us. So those things are addressed in this. So the National Institute of Education, the NIE in 1975, said that any factor that might influence a person to limit or might cause others to limit his or her considerations of a career solely on the basis of gender. So it's something that they want to research and make sure that it doesn't happen. Guidelines were designed to encourage both sexes to consider all careers and educational opportunities and eliminate sex role stereotyping by those using interest inventory results in the career counseling process. So if old assessments did do that, we want to clear those things out and then avoid them. Okay, we want to fix the problems of sex typing. The debate is, do men and women have similar interests or different interests, right? And that's something that we can debate forever and we'll never have an answer that will satisfy everyone. Men and women may differ in the way they respond, react, and endorse interest inventory items. And that's just how it is. So it's kind of like one of those debates. We want to say that everyone is the same, but we are actually raised differently, right? So that means that we're going to be a little different that way as well. And so they're just bringing that to awareness for everyone. Two most popular is the Strong Interest Inventory, or the SII, and then the other one is the Cooter Occupational Interest Survey. Strong Interest Inventory, SII, the American College Testing Program Interest Inventory, and the Self-Directed Search, SDS, are some of the ones that could be also taken here. They correspond to Holland. Remember Holland in the theory section, where they measure personality types and corresponding work environments. Remember RIASEC. Other types that also do this will be the Cooter Occupational Interest Inventory, the Self-Directed Search, the Strong Instrument, Career Assessment Inventory, the Wide Range Interest and Opinion Test, and the Campbell Interest and Skills Survey. Goal 5 is discovering personality variables. So personality development as a major factor in career development. Early personality development with family interaction influences vocational direction, which is what we talked about before in, again, the theory section, where basically as we grow older with our families and the people who surround us, they will influence you on what you want to do as work, okay? In 1970, the 16 Personality Factor Questionnaire, also known as the 16PF, integrated personality inventories into career counseling programs. So they wanted to see vocational personality patterns that exist or emerge, and then also occupational fitness. Are you ready to actually start working? These traits are compared with occupational profiles and provide vocational observations and occupational fitness projections. So they'll take those scores and then compare it to other ones that are already established. Vocational observations, information concerning the person's potential for leadership and interpersonal skills and potential benefits from academic training. Okay, and then there's also occupational fitness, rank how the person compares with specific occupation profiles from extremely high to extremely low. So again, they're going to compare these established ones to the person that is taking it, who is your client. These are examples of this type of assessment: the California Test of Personality, the Minnesota Counseling Inventory, the NEO Personality Inventory 3, the 16 Personality Factor, or the 16PF, the Temperament and Values Inventory, and then the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, which is actually very, very famous and well known. Goal 6 is determining values. In the past 30 years, beliefs and values have been studied in career counseling. You want to find congruence within the inseparables of work and life. So what that is saying is we want to make sure that your work and your life actually do match well. Okay, if there's an incongruence to it, that means that they're not stable. Okay, and we want to make a balance of all of that. Value inventory is into two types. The inventories that primarily measure work values are achievement, prestige, security, and creativity. So achievement is to be able to do the work that you were supposed to do. Prestige is kind of like people acknowledging that you're doing a good job. Security means that you're not going to lose that job very easily. And creativity is when you're actually being able to be creative in your job, which these are the components that are in the work value that they want to measure. Inventories that measure values associated with the broader aspects of lifestyle as well is important because they want to see who you are when you're living your life. Examples of this would be the work environment preference schedule, the work values inventory, study of values, the survey of personal values, and the values scale. Goal 7 is exploring career maturity variables, also known as career development inventories. Measures vocational development as specific dimensions from which one is judged to be vocationally mature. So we want to see whether or not you're ready to actually start working. Continuous development process that can be segmented in a series of stages and tasks. Super, remember him, he's a person who's into career development. He says that there's an exploration and a decline section. Orientation towards work. So what is your attitude towards it? Planning is competency dimension. So do you actually understand what you're supposed to do? And that's how you plan, right? Consistency of vocational preferences is consistency dimension. And then that means, are you still stable? Do you actually still want to do this over time? And then the wisdom of vocational preferences, which is a realistic dimension, is, whether or not this is actually something that's achievable. Okay, so for this one, it would be the career development inventory, the career maturity inventory, cognitive vocational maturity test. I'm sorry, my dog is whining. Adult career concern inventory, and the salient inventory. Goal 8 is using computer-based assessment, computer-based guidance systems, CACG, and the online systems. In the last 30 years, the use of computer-based assessments has steadily increased. And that's kind of obvious because even when we're doing our assessment for our Project B, you guys are doing it online, right? It's more convenient. It doesn't require a person to be there, so it's cheaper as well. And these are ones that are been vetted that says that it's okay for you to take this online. The results are immediately available to clients, which is wonderful. You guys want to know exactly what your scores are immediately, and when you do it online, you can. Interpret results to clients by occupational fit with lists of career options. So because certain people score certain things all the time, then these results can pop up immediately because it knows exactly which ones that should be suggested. Concerns about validity and instruments have been expressed. Again, is it really measuring what it is? Sometimes people are saying it isn't. So again, that's just something that's always going to be questioned, okay? The instrument validity, the scoring, the search, and the interpretive functions. Again, these are things that they might offer when you do an online version. Weighing items into scales and ensuring error-free scoring. That's really great because usually there's no human error. When you do it with a person and you hand score it, you might actually mess up because you're not paying attention or whatever, right? And so that's just a possibility. And with computers, as long as whoever entered the scores properly programmed it, if they programmed it right, then that means that the score should be accurate. If you can't see how it's being done, you don't know if it's actually happening, right? All right, assessment, self-assessment procedures for career counseling. These are now different types of assessments as well, but they're not necessarily survey questions like you were talking about before. The first one is called autobiography. Autobiography may complement an intake interview. Usually written, but can be given orally. So that means that, let's say that you take the intake interview, you're finished with that. Now you're saying, let me ask you to write an autobiography for me. Okay, so the directions would be, if you were going to do an autobiography, is write an autobiography of your life. That's pretty plain and simple, right? Unstructured autobiography has the advantage of leaving the subjects of the response up to the client. So unstructured means that there are no major directions, okay, or no specific questions. You're just saying, write an autobiography of your life. And that will allow the client to write anything that they want about their lives, right? But the disadvantage, obviously, is that clients can choose to avoid subjects that could be significant, maybe because it was painful or embarrassing, so they're not going to write about it, right? But in a structured one, they might say something like, what happened at age 2? What happened at age 3? So very specific, and they want to know all the different things. But if it's an unstructured one with not a lot of questions, it leaves it up to that person to really write what they want to share. Structured outline to follow a work biography is also available. So again, we'll talk about that. So focus questions to uncover specific variables. So again, now these are a little bit more structured, like the previous slide said before was unstructured. Now these are specific ones that you can ask to make it more structured, okay? Use the tab subjects of importance revealed in the interview. So these are questions that you can ask for a structured autobiography. How did you become who you are? What does your family want you to do? Your mother, your father, your siblings, uncles and aunts? Who has been the most influential person in your life and how? What do you predict will be your career or job or work in the future? What have others, such as your friends, families, teachers, etc., told you about your career or what your career should be? In an outline format, trace the development of your interests and abilities. What are some major events in your life? Make a list of your likes and dislikes and relate them to your experiences. Compose a list of your most significant problems. Circle those that are the most troublesome. So as you can see, these are some sample questions that make it a lot more specific, which is a more structured one. Interest identification. Non-standardized appraisal tools and techniques by Goodman in 1993 said that clients are instructed to write down 20 things they like to do. They can list activities done at work, leisure activities such as going to the movies, partying, reading, or taking classes. The following code is assigned to each interest listed. So once you give this a type of assessment or assessment, once they put those 23 things and then they identify all that, you put a T next to the activities that you would enjoy with additional training. Put an R next to each item that involves risks, such as physical risks, emotional risks, or intellectual risks. Put a PL besides those items that are required planning. And then indicate with an A or a P or an A/P whether you prefer to do the activity alone or with people or with both. Next to each activity, put the date when you last engaged in it, and then star your 5 favorite activities. So in this one, you're going to be able to then find out which ones are ones that the client prefers, right? Because they're kind of like their opinions and their experiences. They tell you the 20 things that they thought of, and then they also rate it all, right? And then we talk about it as a client and a therapist or a client and a probation officer or whatever it is that you become. Okay. Again, these are ways to understand a person. Remember, these assessments are to understand the facets of a person, so that's what it's doing. Each activity provides a counselor and client with relevant subjects for discussion and evaluation of their significance. Clients are encouraged to draw conclusions from each statement through self-assessment and relate it to interests. Another interest identification activity is, this is another one, is develop a list of at least 10 role models. Explain why you selected each model and relate your choices to interests. List 5 occupations you like and 5 you do not like. List the types of activities you enjoy. List the school subjects you like most and least. And list your favorite TV programs, magazines, and books, because those things actually also might influence you as well. So again, this is just to understand a little bit more about their interest identification of your client. Card sorts. Interest, values, hobbies, skills, and personality characteristics are what usually are determined through card sorts. Name and description of an occupation on them into 3 categories. So basically what this is that you have a bunch of cards with specific things that are written on there. And then you give it to your client, and then your client is going to put it in 3 different piles. Pile 1 would be would not choose to work. Pile 2 is would choose to work. And pile 3 is like no opinion, maybe because they don't really care for it or hate it or don't know too much about it. Counselors and clients then discuss all categories and identify common themes that emerge. Clients relate interests and common themes to their backgrounds. Okay. If you want to see a description of it via YouTube, there's actually about a 25-minute video that talks about card sorts. I'm not going to make you watch it, but if you're interested to know more about it, I would suggest then you would watch it. And then the second link you see on this slide is a description, and it's just a written description of what a card slide is. Okay, the next one is a lifeline or career life planning experience, and this is for group interactions. Clients to draw a line from birth to death. So take a piece of paper and then have one side as the dot, and then draw a line across it, and then a dot at the end, which is death. The first part is birth. Okay. Now from here, you indicate on it key life experiences and present position, because you guys are probably in your 20s and 30s. You guys are not necessarily at the end where death is, right? Because you're not going to die anytime soon, I hope. So you might be actually be kind of like more in the middle area. And then that's really going to be interesting because you actually don't know what's going to happen in the future. So the purpose, to actively involve clients in concentrating on future tasks and life planning. So you're going to prompt some self-awareness by listing all the things that's going on, and then you're aware of it, but then you're going to also try to predict what's going to happen in the future. Recognize that each person has certain responsibilities in developing his or her own future. Some of you guys are going to want to get married and have children, some of you guys do not. So those things will come with specific responsibilities, right? If you do have children, maybe your children will take care of you when you're older. But if you choose not to, who's going to take care of you when you're older? And that's something that is a different type of responsibility, even though they might not have the responsibility of raising children, right? So we all have different types of responsibilities that's going to happen. So here is an example of what the timeline might look like. Obviously, that picture is kind of like making fun of it, which is, the middle part is just an awkward phase between birth and death. There's actually many more things to it. So this is a lifeline, identifying and stripping of roles. It could be a fantasy time, typical day and special day in the future, life inventory, news releases, resume goals, and then goal setting. These are things that you're going to hope you'll be able to identify as you do this assignment or this project. Guided fantasy, an exercise to increase self-awareness. Um, Not to be used with all clients, although some studies say that it is effective for all types of clients. What this is going to try and uncover subconscious materials that can be used in career decision making. The purpose is that clients will express their needs and desires openly when they are free of perceived restraints, which could be like anxiety, okay? So for this, you need to do the first thing, which is induce relaxation through Jacobs relaxation technique. And that is a link right there for you. It's a 5-minute video on YouTube with closed captioning. I encourage you please to watch this. Stop the PowerPoint now and then do this, or actually after you finish, you can also do it that way as well. But basically, it's a technique that helps calm you down. It relaxes you so that when you talk, you're not necessarily stressed out. 2 is establish the fantasy itself, such as a day on the job or my workplace in the future. So when you're supposed to be relaxed and stress-free, you can talk openly about all these things because you're not necessarily tense or anything like that. And then 3, discuss the reactions of the fantasy. Okay, so again, this is exploration to understand what kind of visualizations they're going to have when they're relaxed, they're not full of restraints or stressors. Skills identification. Identifying skills form previous experiences in a number of activities, including work, hobbies, and volunteer work. The rationale for this one is clients may fail to recognize skills they have developed through experiences and also do not know how to relate them to occupational requirements. And this is wonderful. So what this is saying is that you're going to put a list of experiences that you have had, whether it's for fun, for work, or when you did for volunteer, because sometimes students don't realize that the volunteer work they do can be put into their resumes, right? Sometimes if you're working in the field of disability, let's say that you have someone in your family that you take care of who has a disability like autism or let's say schizophrenia or diabetes, you can actually put that into your resume. You're taking care of a family member, so you have super close contact with people with disabilities, a specific type of disability, and you are actually an expert when it comes to being a family member, but as well as the person that takes care of them. And so you can actually put that on your resume. And those are things that people might not necessarily realize. So when you do this activity and you're helping a client, you can point those things out for them. The self-directed search is also something that you can use to help with a skill identification. And there's also computerized career counseling programs that you can also take. Information about assessment instruments. So any type of assessment that you've ever taken, if it is actually a professional, legit one, not like from a fashion magazine like Cosmo or something like that, those assessments can actually be found in the Mental Measurement Yearbook. Every year they have this book. It's a physical copy, and then it would write summaries and descriptions about that. There's also another book called Test and Print and another book called Tests. And again, they all provide information about all these different types of assessments. So let's say you're interested in a specific one. You can actually look it up in this and then read a little bit about their reliability, their validity, and all that wonderful stuff.